All right, here we go for the third session. This has gone really quickly. Of course, I enjoy hearing myself talk, so I hope we're in the same boat. After this, I'll be tired of hearing myself talk, but we have one more session to do it. Okay, so I ended a little early last time. I didn't realize that, but that's okay. I got off on the time. So the good news is I'll do this third session, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, so be writing down your questions and thinking about them. We'll end at 12:30 sharp, so don't worry about that. That'll still be the case, but we'll have some time for discussion. So just to kind of get the narrative arc of what I've been trying to do this morning in this short version, and thank you for your great hunger and dialogue. It's been really sweet. The first session talked about how the Bible really is a philosophy and that it's helpful for us to rediscover that sort of way of thinking about God's word for us. The second, we drilled down a little bit into the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly the shocking way in which happiness or flourishing is described as entailing suffering. There's more that could be said about that as well. In this third session, I want to then kind of look and say, all right, well, what if we adopt this idea of Christianity as a philosophy about happiness, what are some really specific areas that we can apply this to and look and ask the Bible a set of questions that maybe we're not used to asking it in really practical ways. And so I want to talk about a big topic of emotions. Now, what I'm going to say in the Jesus the Philosopher book, this comes from that. So if you want another kind of round of it, and in that book, what I do is, in the second half of the book, there are three topics. Again, I addressed emotions, relationships, and happiness. And in each case, there are two chapters for each of them. The first chapter addresses what the ancient world said about the topic, and then the second question addresses what the Bible says about it. So what I'm going to do in a shorter version here is kind of those two chapters on emotions, with some other different material as well in here about this topic of philosophy. So that's kind of the introduction to it. So the first thing to just acknowledge here, and let me look at my own handout, make sure I've got the same things here. So the first thing is just to recognize that emotions, I don't know what you think about emotions. In fact, I have a pretty good guess that there's a wide range of opinions about emotions, everything from believing they're the most important thing, and some of you, for various family of origin reasons or other reasons, think that they're a bad thing, and we need to avoid them. We're going to talk about all that. But no matter what, emotions are affecting us all the time, whether we realize it or not. Emotions are a powerful and really inescapable part of what it means to be human. Emotions are mysterious, and they are a power in our lives that drive us to love and kill and marry and divorce and buy things we can't afford and drink too much and worship invisible deities. Underneath all those things are emotions. Again, some people are more attuned to their emotions than others, and this is a complex reality of genetics. Some people genetically seem to be more inclined. Personality, which is a complex thing that develops in us. Your upbringing, maybe you had a father who said, don't cry about that, or a mother or something, or maybe you had the opposite of that. They're also a function, different emotions in us are learned responses, and our circumstances. Some people have lives that are very different than others. All of those things affect the emotions we feel, and especially how affected we are by them. Artists are often the ones who are more attuned to their emotions and learn ways to express them, whether it's in paintings of various sorts or in one of the great influences on my life today, Taylor Swift. I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan, not joking. So I listen to Taylor Swift. And whatever else bad you can say about 2020, Taylor Swift came out with 2 albums this year. So it's not an all bad year. But artists often help us sort of through songs, often help us understand our own emotions. This is the power of songs and poetry. Lyricists are really just poets. Poetry helps us understand and make sense of our own emotions a lot of times. That's the power of artists in our lives. The key principle I'd want to say to kind of wrap up this introduction to emotions is that if we're not aware of our emotions and learning to address them, they will continue to affect us. Maybe you think of yourself as a very non-emotional person or maybe emotionally self-controlled person. It's probably not as true as you think it is, but whether you have emotions or not, they will affect you, and they'll often come out sideways. A key therapeutic principle is that whatever we don't process internally comes out externally, right? If you don't learn to pay attention to what's really going on, it's still going to come out in one way or another, okay? So that's just basic introduction. Emotions are ever present. They're a big part of what it means to be human, and I'll talk about that more here in a minute. But what are they? What are our emotions? Well, in addition to Baby Yoda, one of the things that's been great about Disney Plus is the ability, I think, to go back and savor some of the earlier great Pixar movies. And a little while ago, I rewatched again with my daughter Inside Out. And at my age, watching a movie means I watch about 15 minutes, fall asleep, and then I wake up at the end. But I've seen the movie enough times, and I know what it means, that we rewatched Inside Out. This time I actually did stay awake. And once again, I laughed, I cried, and it is a remarkable story. And in fact, when I rewatched it a little while ago, I'd forgotten just how engaging and how remarkably insightful the movie is, this human movie is. Maybe some of you watched Soul, which I think, just came out, I think on Christmas Day, was that when it came out? And which I think is good. I don't think it's as good as Inside Out. I think Inside Out is even more insightful. And along with Toy Story and Up and Soul and some of the others, I really do think Inside Out is kind of Pixar at its creative and insightful best. If you haven't seen it, apologies for a spoiler alert. You can run out of the room. But on the other hand, if you still haven't seen Inside Out, I don't know what you're doing with your life, so I'll give a sorry but not sorry, okay? Now, the Inside Out title refers to the way in which the story alternates between the outside life of Riley, who's this happy and active 11-year-old girl, and the inside of what's going on inside her head/emotions. And the movie, if you've seen it, cuts back and forth between this exterior life going on and this control room where you have 5 emotions: joy, sadness, fear, disgust, and anger. And they're perfectly cast. It's Amy Poehler and Phyllis Smith from The Office and Mindy Kaling. So it's really well cast, really well done. And not only is the story engagingly told with some great lines, like if you remember when Anger has these great moments, including when they're in California and they first encounter broccoli pizza, Anger says, "Congratulations, San Francisco, you've ruined pizza." All right, there's some great lines like that. But profoundly, like any good narrative, the movie functions at more than one level. A kid can enjoy it at one level, but like any good story, there's something deeper going on as well. The narrative level of the story you can follow and enjoy, but once you start paying attention to the deeper message that's there, it's very profound. And at one climactic scene, Riley is overwhelmed with anger and disappointment and hurt, and she's getting on a bus to run away. And the emotions control panel inside of her that runs, these various emotions, it goes dark and can't make her feel anything. And I think this is a really great metaphorical way of describing depression and the darkness that comes, that things are so overwhelming that you can't even feel anything, it feels like. It's a very powerful way to picture a depressed person's psyche, shut down emotionally. And even more profoundly, I think this ends up proving a central part of the story, that at that moment, if you know the story, it's sadness, not joy, that actually saves the day by making Riley feel something that makes her emotions console get going again. It's not just joy, it's actually sadness that really ends up saving the day. Now, at the heart of the movie's vision for what it means to be human and to be happy is that the emotion characters inside of Riley must come to realize that maturity looks different from childhood. I think this is kind of the big point of it, where in childhood, joy and happiness are basically the primary goal and the primary emotion. But through her various experiences, as she matures, Riley gets to the point where her core memories, and if you've seen the movie, these are like marbles that are like the core memories. These core memories are no longer just happiness, but in her place of maturity, they're actually a mixture of both sadness and joy. They're marbled blue and yellow. And the point that I think the movie's making that's very insightful is that for a mature, stable human, all the emotions, all the feels, are part of what it means to be fully human. And then at the end of the story, after the trauma and the new stage of maturity is reached, the islands of personality are rebuilt for her, this great sort of final scene of the movie, the emotions console is replaced by a much more complex and nuanced one. Instead of these 5 basic emotions, she's no longer just this happy little girl, but she's a fully emotional being with life consisting of a wide range of emotions. And then, of course, in this great moment, then one of them says puberty on it, and they're like, what is this? We have no idea, right? So it's just classic. Now, I start with this sort of exegesis of the movie Inside Out because I do think it is a beautiful, insightful approach to the complex and universally human question of what emotions play in our human experience. But what are they? Well, our English word emotion has really become primarily a negative term that's used in distinction from rational thinking. As the Oxford English Dictionary goes on to define emotions, strong feelings, passion, instinctive feeling as distinguished from reasoning or knowledge. So notice that's really stacking the deck in a way for the English language and therefore the English culture, the Anglophone world, in that it's defining emotions in a way that's the opposite of thinking. The pastor Mark Schlesky, in a great book he has on emotions, offers this exercise to prove this point, that if you were to say to someone and ask them, or I'll ask it this way, if I were to ask you, how would you feel if I said to you, you seem very emotional today, versus you seem very rational today? That shows that those two words are really, one's we connotated as positive and the one is connotated as very negative. But the residential experts today on our emotions are not so much Pixar, although they're insightful, but psychologists, neurologists, psychiatrists, counselors, therapists. What do they say emotions are? Well, you actually get 2 different competing answers. Some experts describe emotions purely neurologically and physiologically as a function of body chemicals. And so many people along these lines would describe our emotions as really just perceived changes in our body, such as heart rate, breathing rate, hormones, and then emotions are us just naming those physiological changes with a term. And so that's all they really are. They're really just neurological/physiological changes. Others would understand emotions primarily psychologically as a function of cognitive expectations and outcomes. So happiness occurs when our experiences match our expectations. Sadness occurs, or frustration or disappointment, when they do not. Anger comes when someone or something is blocking a perceived desire or expectation. And so emotions are a function of our mental state, our minds, not just our brains. Now, this taps into a massive debate and discussion within all kinds of realms: psychiatry, psychology, neurology, brain scan imaging, it's philosophy, brain mind, what's interesting in brain and mind, and there's a whole world of discussion on that. The great theologian Kim Van Hooser, I think, astutely observes that theorists of emotions, whether it's the neurological, physiological view or the more cognitive brain or the mind view of it, tend in both cases to be toward reductionism. In other words, the people that do the one tend to reduce all of the complex human experience of emotions either only to physiology, or others tend to do it only to toward cognition or mind versus brain. Who's right? Well, it's complicated. And I think part of our problem is a linguistic one. It's a problem with our words, because our word emotions, as I said, has come to occupy a mental space that I think probably brings more confusion than clarity. It's, as my elderly mother would say, it's gotten too big for its britches. Or maybe better, emotions is too blunt of a tool, I think, as a term, to do the kind of exploratory surgery that's necessary to describe the complexity of what's going on inside of us. In ancient philosophy, they actually had 2 different words for this that we've lost. They distinguished between passions, which were these kind of quasi-physical forces that move people, and affections, which they would describe as thoughts of the heart that affect the will. Unfortunately, in English today, our word emotion kind of has to function for both of those, for both passions and affections, and it's become very negative. And so I think we have trouble thinking and talking about what emotions are, partly because we just don't have a good word or words to describe these different senses of emotions. And that leads me to say that, while the experts today are neurologists, therapists, counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists, you may be surprised to learn, I was surprised to learn, that in the ancient world, the experts on emotions were actually the philosophers. And that philosophy in the ancient world, Aristotle, Plato, Seneca, all these guys, they talked a lot about emotions. It seems very weird, because again, we think of philosophy today, we think very esoteric, very disconnected from reality. Emotions were one of the primary topics of discussion in ancient philosophy because ancient philosophy was about how to live well. And so they recognized if you don't learn to think about what emotions are and how to process them, you will never live a good life. And so in the ancient world, they talked a lot about this. And in fact, the philosophers were often suspicious of religions in their kind of religion, because religions, they felt like, encouraged an unbridled, unthoughtful use of emotions, where emotions needed to be thought about more carefully. So within the ancient philosophical tradition, they all agreed that emotions were crucial, but they had big differences of opinion about what emotions were, just like we do today. And we can describe these. I think I've got three different versions of it: Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoicism. Let me go over these briefly. The Platonic understanding, so Plato and his disciples, their understanding of emotions was very much what we can call a non-cognitive tradition. So within the Platonic understanding of emotions, reason is over against passion. And so one of the illustrations that Plato uses is that the human soul consists of two horses, one of which can be called reason and the other passion. And the charioteer of these two horses, the one trying to hold them, is the human. And it's a fight, it's a battle between controlling these two horses together. Rationality is one and passions is the other. And so in this case, similar to the neurologists and psychologists or others today, emotions are primarily an uncontrollable negative thing. And in fact, what Plato says is you actually can't control emotions by reason. You have to control them through other things like poetry and music. Okay? So you think of like a beast, being soothed by music or something. So emotions or passions are a negative thing that are not controllable by reason, and they're kind of something suspect, okay? Part of the Platonic tradition develops in a very early medical tradition, because remember, the philosophers were the intellects of the ancient world, so a lot of them, the doctors were kind of a subset of philosophers. And you may have heard of the early Dr. Galen and his four humors view of medicine, that the body consists of four humors or four liquids: blood, it's kind of gross sounding, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. So those are the four liquids in your body. And so from that physiological view comes one of the earliest views of personality types. And I remember when I was in college, we used these personality types. Maybe you've heard them too: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. If some of you heard those before, that comes from Galen's physiological understanding of the world. So in other words, sanguine refers to blood, choleric is a black bile, or is a yellow bile, I guess, or black bile, I can't remember which is which. Melancholic, and then phlegmatic is, phlegm means you're slow and mellow, I guess, or something, right? So the point is, in this sort of view, who you are as a person emotionally, whether it's sanguine, choleric, melancholic, or phlegmatic, is a function of which of the four liquids inside your body is dominant, right? So it's a very much a non-cognitive view of emotions. You got it? Now, quite different from that, Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, who goes very different ways with them, develops an entirely different view of emotions, and we can call this the cognitive tradition. Aristotle instead argues that the human person is actually a unity of these two things, both passions and cognition, and that emotions are actually the result of cognitive and bodily perceptions. Okay, so this is very much like a more mind view rather than a brain view today in modern terminology, that emotions are not bad. They can be bad, they can be distorted, they can mislead you, they can deceive you, but they're not inherently bad. Together, both passions and reason are what it means to be fully human. And again, passions or emotions are affected by cognition. So, an illustration that I've made up for this, if you think about when someone sees a sizzling steak, medium, 12-ounce sirloin, and it's put on a plate in front of you, you're going to feel certain emotions, okay? And those emotions are really a function of cognition going on. And in fact, when I said that, you all felt some emotions. Especially it's a good time of day to do this as we're getting near lunch, right? Some of you who are vegetarians or vegans, your emotion might have been bloody slab of meat illegally and immorally produced, right? That was your emotion. I'm not that. I think I'm really hungry and that sounds really good. Either one is fine. All is welcome here. But the point, what Aristotle would say, he doesn't use this illustration, I made this up. He'd say that the emotions you feel are actually a function of certain commitments and certain other thoughts and experiences you've had before. There's a bodily element to it. If I've had a really good steak before and know what that tastes like and I like that, and probably me liking it is a function of various cultural things that have happened to me or not as well, all of that, the emotions are a function of things going on inside my mind, okay? If someone were to put before you on a plate a brick, maybe with some butter poured over it, aside from the butter part of it, most of us would not have positive emotions towards that unless, for some reason, you have, and there is a psychological disorder of people that actually like eating non-organic things or non-food items, right? There are people that are like into this. I think most of us would say there's somewhat of a cognitive disorder in that. I'm not trying to judge anyone if that's you, if you like to eat bricks. But the point is, that again is a function of our perception of the value of that brick for my body, right? Good or bad. However, if you live next to a river and the water, there's been heavy rains for a couple weeks and the water's coming up to your house, if someone shows up with a big truck of steaks versus a big truck of bricks, your feelings and perception of those two things are, again, the emotions you have are going to be a function of your perception of what's more valuable for you at that moment. Okay? So this is the Aristotelian view that emotions are part of what it means to be human. You shouldn't deny them. They're not just irrational. In fact, they're influenceable by cognition. All right? Now, there's one more group, and this is what we can call Stoicism. As these views develop into the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, the dominant philosophy among most people in the Mediterranean world, the most influential one, the Oprah of the day, was what became called Stoicism. Stoicism was a very influential, very practical, very helpful philosophy of life. And there were some really famous Stoics like Seneca, and one of the last Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius, was a Stoic as well. You can still read his meditations, which are amazing. Are You Not Entertained? If you've ever seen Gladiator, he's the father who, in that somewhat fictional version, the emperor in Gladiator kills. Marcus Aurelius is the father who's killed. But he was a great Stoic, and there were hundreds of Stoics, and it was a very influential philosophy. And this was the dominant philosophy in Jesus' own day as well. And for Stoicism, it very much centered on emotions because the goal to happiness, what they cared about, was two things. Ataraxia, so it's A-T-A-R-A-X-I-A, which means basically tranquility. Ataraxia, tranquility, is achieved through apatheia, freedom from passions. You can hear our word apathy comes from that, but that's more negative a term. Apatheia means you're free from the influence of emotions. So key to Stoicism was that you can find happiness, flourishing, only by coming free from the influence of emotions. So I always think of this as like, have you ever seen the Darth Vader shirt where it's got like emotions or moods of Darth Vader? It's got like 9 pictures: happy, sad, joyful, and they all look the same, right? You with me? Okay, right. So you could imagine sewing a Stoics. It probably wouldn't sell as well as a Darth Vader shirt, but all the different emotions look exactly the same. Because, and I want to be fair to Stoicism, because it's a very sophisticated philosophy. They weren't just saying emotions are bad. They're actually more like the Aristotelian tradition. But what they are saying is that you'll never be happy if you let emotions control your life. That's what the Stoics would say, okay? Stoicism was not only very influential back then, it's had quite a revival. It's always had adherents, but it's had quite a revival in the last 25 years or so. There's a whole world of Stoicism. I'm just curious, have any of you read anything like The Daily Stoic or heard of Ryan Holiday or others? I'm curious if any of you know about this. In the business world, in the entrepreneurial world, there's a lot of people that adopt principles of Stoicism. Ryan Holiday has written this, international bestseller again called The Daily Stoic. I read it. It's like a daily devotion of Stoic macroisms, basically. They have these Stoicism coins that have like key principles. I didn't buy them myself. They're pretty expensive, but some friends of mine bought them for me as a gift once. Half joke, half not. They're these little nice coins that say like Stoic phrases on them, macrosms like amor fati, learn to love whatever the fates give you, or memento mori, so remember death, remember your death. That key to living well is to always remember every day that you're going to die. And so there were all these key Stoic principles that were summed up and were very helpful. And actually they are very helpful because Stoicism really emphasizes personal responsibility. Don't showing up in life as a victim. Take responsibility for your own actions. Take responsibility for your own emotions, etc. And this was a very dominant philosophy then. It's a very influential philosophy today. And notice, at the core of it is how to handle emotions. Because they would say, for example, if you give yourself over to letting emotions control you, you'll never be productive and happy, because you are really a victim of your circumstances rather than embracing whatever is before you, okay? So here's the big question. That's all fine, Pennington, okay, blah, blah, blah. What in the world does this have to do with the Christian faith and the Bible? Well, here is the point. If I'm right, which of course I think I am, but if I'm right that Christianity is very aware of the great human questions, and in fact very aware of the other philosophies of the world, and is consciously speaking right into the philosophies of the world and saying, here's the true philosophy of the world, we shouldn't be surprised that the Bible is going to have some things to say about emotions, because this was a dominant issue within all ancient philosophy, because it was a dominant issue in human experience. So if the Bible's worth its salt, if it's worth being something to guide our lives, we should expect that it's going to say something about emotions. So what does the Bible say about emotions? Well, I'll have to be very brief here. And I'm not, again, just trying to get you to buy the book if you can get the longer version. But I'll be very brief here, and I'll give you 3 sort of topics within this. Emotions in God's world, educating our emotion, and then some practical practices. The first point is simply this. According to the Bible, emotions are a central part of what it means to be a human. And the argument that's made for that, and the first thing I'm going to say here is going to shock you a little bit, the first argument that's made for that is that God himself has emotions. I'll let that sink in. Have you ever paid attention to how often in the Bible, God is described as having emotions such as compassion, anger, joy, jealousy, grief, satisfaction, and most of all, love. In fact, God is very often described as having and acting from real human emotions. Now, many people, including many theologians, would say that that's not real, that that's just what we call an anthropomorphism, projecting something onto God, like, which there are anthropomorphisms, like God's hand or God's foot. Or I don't know, maybe that's not in the Bible. Is God's foot in the Bible? Maybe it is. But God's hand is definitely in the Bible, right? Or God's sitting. So yes, there are anthropomorphisms, things that we project metaphorically about God. And many people would say that God's emotions are that. I would carefully beg to differ, along with other theologians. This develops in the theological tradition of what's called God's impassibility. You can hear the word passion in there. That is an important doctrine, God's impassibility. But what God's impassibility doesn't mean is that he doesn't have emotions. It means that he's not controlled by his passions in a bad way. And you see, what's happened in many theologians' traditions is that we've thrown out the idea that God has emotions because we've adopted this very negative view of emotions, right? If we have a very negative view of emotions, that emotions are somehow weak or emotions are somehow out of control, then we would want to say, rightly, God doesn't have those. But if you do that, then I think you're going to be pretty hard-pressed to make sense of who God is, who is said to be motivated by compassion and love. If those aren't real, yes, he's not controlled by them in the way a human is, but if God's not really loving and not really compassionate, then what is he? And is that good that he wouldn't be? And then why would he say he is? Now, if you're still not convinced, then what about Jesus, who is said to be the exact representation of God's nature, Hebrews 1? Does Jesus have emotions? Yes. When you read the Gospels, you see that Jesus has a lot of emotions, and you can calculate them. B.B. Warfield, up the road at Princeton, did a very famous essay on this, where he, like a 50-page essay, it was really helpful, where he calculates Jesus' emotions, and it's very clear the number one emotion that Jesus is said to have, real human emotion, is compassion. And you know what the second most common emotion Jesus expresses in the Gospels? Anger. Not anger because he stubs his toe or gets a splinter or meanly, but anger at those who don't have compassion for others. And there are other emotions, joy, grief, sadness. There are lots of emotions Jesus expresses, and those are not a negative thing. Again, he's not controlled by his emotions in the sense that we might be, but to be human as manifested in the God-man, who is the perfect and complete human, the second Adam, is to have emotions. So if you have adopted, I want to challenge you here, if you have adopted an idea from culture or language or your upbringing that emotions are inherently bad, I want to say to you, that's not what the Bible says. God himself has some crucial emotions in a controlled way. Jesus, the God-man, who is the representative of what the fullness of humanity can look like. He's the second Adam who completes. He's the teleosoner, the complete human. He is shown to have emotions in appropriate ways. And then if you look at how we are talked to about in emotions in the rest of the Bible, you will see, say, in the Psalter, in the book of Psalms, that humans experience the whole gamut of emotions, and they're not condemned for doing so. Not only joy, but also grief and sadness. That those are part of what it means to be human. That's not wrong. Those emotions are not negative. They're not something to be avoided. They are part of what it means to be human. And then think about all the emotions that are actually commanded of us. We're many times commanded to rejoice, to actually have joy. We're commanded to have compassion. Think about all the times we're told that, and that's not just an action, that's actually to feel care for someone else. We're commanded to be patient, which maybe you sound like that's an action, but that's an emotional state that manifests itself or not. We're commanded to grieve and regret. We're commanded to fear or not fear certain things, and most of all, we're commanded to be loving. I always think of the great illustration that John Piper used way back about emotions and love versus duty. He gives the illustration that what if you, those of you who are married in here, show up at your door, you knock on your own door for your 25th wedding anniversary or any anniversary or Valentine's Day, and you got flowers behind your back, and then your wife, opens the door, and you give flowers, and she says, "Oh, you shouldn't have," and you say, "It's my duty." You know there's something wrong there, right? But you may say, well, I'm a non-emotional, I'm not controlled by emotions, so here you go, I've done the right thing. What's wrong with that? The virtue entails and requires actually a certain emotion. And maybe I should give a PSA here. You shouldn't do that, men, right? Just in case. That shouldn't be the flowers, yes, but don't say it's my duty. Definitely say it's because I love you. I delight in you. I'm thankful for you. Those emotional responses are crucial for the event to actually be right and good and beautiful. It's not a separate thing. It's not something to be gotten rid of. It's part and parcel of what it is. Think about the fruit of the Spirit, the marks of someone who is a Christian or not, and the marks especially of someone who is manifesting the work of God in them. What are they? Think how many of these are emotions or directly impacted by emotions. Love, joy, peace, that's ataraxia, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Almost every one of those is an emotion or is a behavior that is motivated by a certain emotion. It's remarkable, isn't it? And then think about the deeds of the flesh. How many of these are emotions as well? He says, many of them are deeds, but they're all motivated by emotions. Sexual immorality, which is coming out of some strong emotion inside of you. Impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgies. All of those, again, are either directly emotions or things that are motivated by certain emotions. Those who belong to Christ Jesus, Paul says in this place, Galatians 5, have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires, but are filled with the Spirit, which is a different set of emotions. Okay? Pushing on to this more, we can recognize that emotions are actually, again, part of morality or virtue. I just gave the romantic situation of it. And yes, emotions can be distorted. They can really be misrepresentations. We can think wrongly. We can have false emotions, like one of the most grievous things about a victim of rape. That person often feels shame and guilt that's false. They feel like it's their fault. There are wrong emotions. That is, there are distorted, perverted emotions that are a result of wrong thinking, of psychological damage and wounding. So yeah, not all emotions are right or appropriate. Hear me clearly. But the point is, emotions are in what we can call motives, which if you can hear that word motive is in the word emotion. That's where it's motive, it's motion out of is what an emotion is. Motives matter, both legally in a juridical sense and personally. What your motives for doing something, the emotions, the affections, the commitments, the sensibilities inside of you are part of whether something is right or wrong. So if you commit a crime in the judicial system, whether you did it by accident or whether you did it out of a certain desire, like a passion that was in the moment, or whether you did it out of a premeditated commitment, all of that matters in whether to the degree in which the crime is punished. You ever thought about that? Like, why is it not just purely the thing was done or not? It's because there's a fundamental recognition that something going inside is part of whether something is moral or not. Right? Or if a famous mean-spirited philanderer who is, unkind to everyone around him, if he writes a large donation check to a Stop Human Trafficking charity from money that he has stolen, that's not a virtuous act, right? You can't just say, well, the action is all that matters. The motives and the interior character of the person is part of that morality. This is a fundamental philosophical sort of reality that I don't have time to do more of. Just trying to point out to you, emotions are a really crucial part of what it means to be human and what it means to be a moral human, okay? So my last move then here is second to last is to say, what do we do and how does the Bible talk about it? Well, I think the Bible's view about emotions is a cognitive view of emotions, that our emotions are educatable, or maybe better, they're transformable, they're sculptable in our lives, and that they need to be. So you can fall off the knife edge either way. You could say emotions are bad or they're irrelevant, they're not part of our life. I hope the things I've said make you so that's not the case. Or you can fall off the other side and say, whatever I feel is whatever it is, and don't tell me to feel otherwise. I think the Bible's view on emotions is much more sophisticated and wise than that. It says to be human is to have emotions. You're commanded to have certain emotions. You're commanded to not live into other certain emotions. And so we need to use our wisdom to shape and train our emotions over time. And we can call this educating our emotions. Always remember, I'm not saying by that this kind of quick fix, because there are real psychiatric and neurological, chemical, hormonal psychological wounds that make this more complicated. So don't hear anything I'm saying being just tell yourself to not feel that way and you won't. That's foolish, right? Don't tell I know that a lot of times we treat children that way as well, but it's not helpful, right? Because our emotions are very complex things, and there are real physiological and neurological and hormonal aspects to them as well. So don't treat them in a kind of flat way. Nonetheless, we can, over time, educate ourselves to help our emotions mature. And again, the goal is true shalom or happiness. Notice the Christian goal is not the Stoics' goal. The Stoics' goal is to get free from emotions so that you can be happy. That's not the Christian view of emotions. The Christian view of emotions are properly ordered, mature emotions. It's very different. Stoicism says you'll only be happy when you stop listening to any emotions. Christianity says to have emotions is to be human, but some emotions are better than others, and some are absolutely central to develop as part of being a mature person. I always think of what Paul says in Philippians. Philippians is such a great book. I'll give you a third thing to read this afternoon. Philippians is such a great book about emotions because he emphasizes rejoicing constantly. And yet then he drops this line that basically could come right out of Seneca. He says in 4:11-12, I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. In other words, and what's the answer? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The point is that emotions matter. He's exhorting people to think about good things, to rejoice in certain things, to love one another. And yet he also says, no matter what my circumstances, I can still have ataraxia. I can still have tranquility or contentment. Such a mature, sophisticated philosophy of emotions. And again, I've spent quite a while reading deeply in psychology and neurology and brain science and ancient philosophy on emotions. Of everything I read on emotions, I have not found anything more nuanced or realistic or sophisticated than what the Bible's philosophy has to say about it. Granted, it's not a neurological textbook, I get that, and we can get some helpful things, knowledge about all that. But when it comes to sort of like a really balanced view of both affirming the importance and the reality of emotions, as well as teaching us how to educate them, I don't think you can do better than the Bible. This is an example of where the Bible is a very sophisticated philosophy of life. So what does that mean? Final step here, practical emotional practices. So what do we do in real life with our emotions? Well, again, let me just reiterate, there are real mental health issues. If you or someone in your life, needs psychiatric help, then get that. And we all need therapy. Everybody should be in therapy at some point, I think. But we need a network of safe people that you can be whole and vulnerable with. And many people need physiological and psychological help and psychiatric help as well. So don't forget your body in all of this. And physical exercise is a huge part of your emotional control too. So it's really important to remember your emotions are part of your embodiedness. But more specifically, here are a couple of what I call Christ Stoicism coins. So this is my kind of laughing with myself, that if I were to produce and try to sell some coins like the Stoics do that were Christ Stoicism, what would they have on them? What would be the words? And I'd have these two ones. First of all, how does the Bible teach us to train and educate our emotions? The first is through reflection. Think about how often the Bible exhorts us, Old and New Testament, to think about things that God has done. And to think about, usually with thanksgiving, to make the intentional choice to give thanks, but to reflect on what God has done. Think about through the Psalter and through Deuteronomy. Think about Deuteronomy 6, 7, and 9. Deuteronomy says, impress the things that God has done on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on the door frames of your houses and your gates. Psalm 1, again, we talked about before, tells us to meditate, to ruminate on God's word, on his instructions. The Sermon on the Mount, again, is inviting us to think about the world in certain ways. Think of like Matthew 6, 25 to 34, where he says, consider the lilies of the field and consider the birds of the air. We are constantly being invited to think about the world in a certain way. Jesus there or anywhere else does not say, don't think about emotions. Emotions are bad. Instead, he says, you have emotions, you have anxiety. Jesus doesn't condemn us for having anxiety. I have a lot of anxiety about money. I had a bad dream last night about taxes and about not doing a good job today. I had anxiety about both those things, right? I was thinking about taxes this morning too. And Jesus doesn't say, you bad person for having anxiety, stop that. He says, okay, I'll meet you where you are. Anxiety is a normal part of human existence. But I want to invite you to reflect. Reflect on God's provision. Reflect on God's care. And so I was on my knees this morning thinking about this talk and thinking about my tax bill. And I thought about Matthew 6, 25 to 34 and thought, you know what? God has provided for me in the past. He's never failed me, right? God's character is such that he's trustworthy. He's not out to get me. He's not just waiting for me to mess up, and then he says, ha, that's not God. Look at 6:25 to 34 of Matthew. He's a heavenly Father that cares for you. He knows your needs before you ask them. And he cares, and he invites me to reflect on God's nature as a heavenly Father who will care for me. It doesn't immediately fix all my emotions. It doesn't mean anxiety will never come back. It's like it's a one-time fix. Oh, I'm done. Never emotions again. Never anxiety. No, but it's a practice I can learn. That when I feel overwhelmed by anxiety, to remember God as a heavenly Father who invites me to process those emotions. He's not saying get rid of them. He's not saying there's a magic wand. He's saying process them in my presence, reflect on who God is and how he can provide for me. And notice how different that is than what the world would offer to us. The world would say escape, find entertainments, find medical or drug ways to escape, or various Eastern religions, which are related to Stoicism in an interesting historical way, would say those things aren't real. I mean, Buddhism's answer, for example, is emotions are not something to be listened to because those circumstances are not actually real. That the key to happiness is to recognize that nothing is real except for your construct of it. And Stoicism basically says the same thing. That's not the Christian answer. The Christian answer is very real. This is a real world. You have real emotions. You have real situations. You have real anxieties. You have real concerns. But as 1 Peter says, cast your anxieties upon the Lord, for he cares for you. That's a practice you and I can develop to learn to educate our emotions over time, not a quick fix, but over time. And then the second one is related to this. It's prayer that includes both confession and supplication. What do you do with guilt and shame? Maybe you deny it because it's such a powerful emotion, such a devastating emotion. Recently, just a couple weeks ago, I was a little harsh with a sound guy, which is not usually my mode, but I was something happened with the sound. I was frustrated. I don't think I was overly harsh. Nonetheless, I don't need to justify myself. I heard later that night that the sound guy was hurt by my tone. It took me like a day and a half to even, I was just so racked with guilt and shame. You know, I was embarrassed. I felt bad for the person. I felt ashamed of myself. It's just shame and guilt are powerful emotions, right? And if you don't feel that, you've probably developed habits to not even pay attention to them, and they're still eating you out on the inside, right? They're still affecting you. Those are very powerful emotions, and they're appropriate emotions. I should have felt some guilt and shame for what I did, right? So what do you do with it? Well, I don't know any other religion or philosophy that enables us to deal with our guilt and shame like the true philosophy, the true religion of Christianity. Because God looks upon us with compassion. He knows that we are dust. He knows that we're sinful. And he offers forgiveness. That I can actually turn to him and say, God, I really screwed up. Maybe it's something big, maybe it's something small. I've got nothing but you. Will you please forgive me? And then if it's someone else, you go to the person. I mean, I wrote the person that night. I texted the person and made it right with them, right? This is a beautiful thing, that we are invited through prayer to process those emotions. Because, friends, if you don't, it's going to come out sideways against your children or against your dog or against your friends or against a coworker. If you start paying attention to the when you feel anger and when you're negative and grouchy, there's something underneath that. There's something underneath that. And a lot of times it's guilt and shame that you're so guarded against, you don't even want to pay attention because it's such a negative emotion. You don't have to live that way. Christianity offers a beautiful, sophisticated, nuanced, realistic vision of your emotions. When you have guilt and shame, go to the Lord. He knows that, he cares about it, and he can forgive you. And then go and make it right with the other person if you need to. It's so different than Stoicism, so different than Buddhism, so different than hedonism, which just says that guilt and shame aren't real. You just need to get rid of those negative emotions. Those are bad emotions. Get rid of them. No. Now, false guilt and false shame are negative, and you do need to work on those. But real guilt and real shame, those are gifts for you to pay attention to what's going on in your life. So don't run away from them. Transmute them, translate them in the Lord's presence into receiving his forgiveness. And the other is through intercession. I already quoted, cast your anxieties upon the Lord, for he cares for you. Prayer, reflection and prayer are absolutely crucial ways that God invites us to be real about our emotions, to pay attention to who we are. They're part of what it means to be human, and to embrace them before the Lord and in his presence. So to conclude, my point in all of this is to show, all three of things I've talked about today, is that God, in God's revealed word, we find an incredibly thoughtful, nuanced, practical philosophy of life that speaks directly to our greatest human question of what it means to be truly happy, what it means to truly flourish, that thing that motivates us, and to start to pay attention to what's really motivating us and turn to the Lord to learn his ways, to take his yoke upon us, to learn to find true happiness and flourishing by adopting, by faith, his philosophy of the world. So thank you. So we have 15 minutes, is that right? Done? Okay, I know you're thinking about steaks, not bricks. I am too. But let's take a few minutes, just if we can, 15 minutes, and just see. Do you have any questions? Do you have clarifying things? Any aha moments? What's coming up for you? Yes, sir. Nice and loud.
So, Joel Osteen.
Yeah.
Is on this subject.
Yeah. Yep.
How would you critique his definition of happiness, his
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. And in fact, this is part of the reason why we, especially those who are not of his theological persuasions, whatever those might be, why we kind of don't talk about happiness, because we see so many kind of plastic versions of it and shallow versions of it. And in the what we call like the health and wealth gospel world, which he's kind of part of that, there's also more charismatic versions of it. We see really imbalanced and unhelpful versions of that kind of happiness that doesn't embrace the reality of suffering. And so what I think I said in the second session is, I think, a more balanced view that God does care about our happiness, our true flourishing, and that's why I don't use the word happy, because happy is so shallow. But God really does care about us, our flourishing, but we find it through the ways of the cross, through the way of death and suffering. Not to sound too morbid, I mean, it's not only that, there's true joy too. We're told to rejoice. But I think my critique of a lot of that kind of television Christianity version is that it's only got half the story, and it all becomes about your best life now, and especially materialistically, Rolls Royce, private jet. If you send $100, God will bless you with $1,000. It just becomes very clear that it's this very imbalanced, consumeristic, materialistic version of happiness. The reason it's powerful is because it's actually half true, right? This is what you always have to remember, that something's not going to get traction if there's not some truth to it, but it's a really imbalanced, not nuanced view that there's a paradox in happiness, which is suffering and taking up your cross, etc. I travel a fair amount, and when I'm in a hotel or something, my personal habit that I can't stop is that I watch television Christianity before I go to bed, which I don't normally, and I just flip through all these channels of crazy television Christianity. It's just like watching a train wreck. You just can't look away, And so I often watch these people for a few minutes at a time, flipping through them, and that's what always strikes me, is that they're onto something, but it's very distorted at the same time. And that's what I would say about that world. Yep.
The goal of that type of teaching is the goal is to be happy.
Right.
And the goal of God is for us to seek Him
To know Him
and surrender to Him, and then happiness is an outcome.
is a byproduct of that. Yeah, that's right. That's a good way to say it. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Good. Other questions, thoughts? Yeah, please. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, that's great. I mean, part of it is that these words we use have different definitions, so we'd kind of have to find them, like shame and guilt. A lot of times we use those kind of interchangeably, and I think what you're talking about, shame, is being defined there in a specific way, probably as an ill feeling that one person puts on another, or society puts on someone. Or you put it on yourself, yeah. I would say that for sure, guilt is something that is the result of sin, and shame is something that's a little bit more public or self-inflicted in a certain way. The problem is that shame biblically means something a little different than that modern definition, because the biblical cultures, like most cultures today, are what we call an honor-shame culture, which is a different kind of sense of shame. It doesn't mean so much personal feeling bad, but shame in an honor-shame culture is something more like a commodity. It's like your value in a society. And so I think a lot of times when the Bible talks about shame, it's actually talking about your kind of standing more than your personal your personal, internal emotional feelings. So I think that's part of the problem, is that psychology uses shame in this different, much more personal, emotional sense. But maybe I'm not answering your question well enough. I mean, what would I say about shame? I think there's true and false shame, I guess is what I'd say. I think there's a lot of false shame. I mentioned the victim of rape or other things, or just you've been told. I was just counseling with someone in my church, and their father told them he said from like age, I don't know, he doesn't remember when he didn't. His father just regularly said to him, "You are worthless. You will never amount to anything. I don't like you. I wish you weren't in my life." I mean, that's a devastating message to receive. And his life has been marked by a lot of shame, and that's a false shame, right? I still think he needs to process it emotionally in the same ways I'm saying, right, to take it before the Lord. But I'd say that's a false shame, where I'd say when I or someone else, commit some public sin that is damaging to myself and others, I think that's a real kind of shame. I should feel shame for that, right? So I don't think in modern psychology and psychotherapy they really distinguish between a good kind of shame. I think most of the time they'd say it's only bad. But I'd say there's a good kind that you can take responsibility for. I hope that answers your question. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
So would you say good shame? Because it seems like an oxymoron. Good shame is to lead us to repentance.
Yeah, good shame is to lead us to repentance. I prefer probably the word guilt, I think, because I think shame is very loaded with a lot of negativity, other kinds of negativity along these lines. I think guilt's maybe a little cleaner word, but yeah, I do think that serves a purpose in our lives. True guilt and shame serve a purpose to lead us to repentance. I think that's true. Again, I'm not promoting a life of shame and guilt. I'm not encouraging that. I think a lot of our shame and guilt is actually probably false shame and guilt. A lot of it probably is. A lot of it comes from, I think in the Protestant tradition especially, our theological anthropology, our understanding of what it means to be human has gotten really distorted to mean basically you suck. I mean, I think a lot of Christian anthropology in certain traditions is basically you're a horrible person, what I call worm theology. And it is true that we're broken, but if you were to say, what is the Bible's primary way to describe humans? I used to do this with my students a lot. I'd say, all right, we're going to do a Rorschach test kind of thing, or a verbal thing. Like, I'm going to say a word. You tell me the first thing that comes to mind. Human. And most of my students would say sinful. I don't think that's the Bible's first answer. I think that's the Bible's second answer. I think the Bible's first answer is beloved or beautiful. I mean, after all, we're made in God's image, right? I think the second answer is sinful, broken, cracked image, whatever you want. The icon is cracked. But it's not the primary thing that God thinks about us. He doesn't primarily think of us as sinful. He primarily thinks of us in his image and in need of redemption, loved, right? That's why he sent the Son. And I do think that shift that has happened in our kind of default theological anthropology, our understanding of what it means to be human, as being primarily sinful, I think that both reflects and accentuates a lot of false guilt and shame that we have, I think, actually. Yep. Were there emotions before the fall? Yeah, I think they're part of what it means to be human. I think obviously there weren't guilt and shame, but I think there was joy, there was love, and those things don't go away, but then these other things get added through the fall. Yeah, good question. Yep.
How would you, as a Christian, learn spiritual battle?
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
With spiritual battle as it relates to emotions? That's a good question. No one's ever asked me that. I'll have to think more about that. But I think that part of spiritual battle probably is a lot of bad emotions. In other words, I think there's probably a lot of false guilt and false shame. That's one way that we might be attacked. I think another is often an appeal to physical, bodily, and psychological emotions to lead us into temptation. Right? I mean, a lot of temptations come from emotions, right? A lot of times hurt emotions, especially like You feel wounded and then you lash out or something. And I think the Christian philosophy would be you learn to educate your emotions over time. You learn to become a virtuous whole person over a long time so that when you experience those negative emotions, you don't just react, you actually respond, to them rather than just react. But it's a good question. I'll think more about that. Thanks. Yeah. Other questions that I can answer? Yeah.
I've heard it said a lot in our culture that, we have this idea that joy and hope are kind of a feeling, but I've also heard it said that joy and hope are kind of a choice as well. Maybe you can
And love, too, you might even say. Yeah, I think a lot of times people do say, just to repeat the question, our joy and hope are like choices, not feelings. And I think a lot of times people, love is a verb kind of thing. I think that's true. I do think that's what those practices are meant to do. They're meant to educate your emotions, but they are primarily emotions. Again, use the duty flowers situation. Again, love, joy, and hope that didn't have an emotional component would not really be what those are and would be a very flat existence. To hope is to actually imagine with anticipation some other state, right? And so I would want to say that they're not merely emotions, or I say they are emotions, but they're not merely feelings. They do entail practices over time to choose to love, even if you don't feel it. But they're not devoid of emotions. Again, the truth's always a knife edge, right? You can fall off one side or the other. The one side would be to say emotions don't matter in those things, and the other side would be to say it's all an emotion. The truth of wisdom is always this knife edge truth, right? It's this balance. One way to say it is that there's a place for, if the virtue is both doing what is right and feeling what is right, I always like to say there's a place for duty on the way to virtue. In other words, I think of what C.S. Lewis says, I think it's in The Weight of Glory or somewhere else, that often, like let's say you see someone sitting a couple of pews in front of you, I'm not thinking of anyone here, you see someone sitting a couple of pews in front of you and you either don't have any feelings about them or you don't like them even, that one of the ways to step towards love is actually to start acting in loving ways towards them. Have you ever noticed that? I mean, when you actually choose to act in certain ways, or in the case of joy, to give thanks, that actually primes the pump. That doesn't mean those things aren't emotions or shouldn't have emotions, but that often you have to jumpstart the emotion by bodily action, is how I'd say. And so it's not an either or, it's a both and of we often lean into and step into educating and developing our emotions in certain ways by choices of action. So great question. I'm glad you asked that. Okay. I think our time is probably up. Thank you. You guys have been a total delight, and I'll see you. And Lord willing, I'll be here tomorrow morning, and we'll talk about the Sermon on the Mount more. Thank you.